There's no doubt that Vanessa Sullivan's death last fall in a car crash was a tragedy. However, it was an accident. It was not murder. The defendant, Danny Dawson, was behind the wheel of the car that night. But that doesn't make him a murderer. You're going to hear exactly what happened that night. You're going to hear that the defendant, Mr. Dawson, Vanessa Sullivan, and Vanessa's friend met up at a bar called Chuggy's for Vanessa's 21st birthday. They had a few drinks. They listened to a local band. You're going to hear from the bartender of that bar. He's going to tell you exactly what he saw. The bartender is going to tell you that Mr. Dawson was being responsible. He wasn't drinking that much that night. He's going to tell you that Mr. Dawson doesn't drink and drive. He's also going to tell you that that night, Mr. Dawson was behaving normally. He wasn't slurring his words. He wasn't stumbling around. Later that night, Mr. Dawson, Vanessa, and her friend leave the bar. Mr. Dawson is driving Vanessa's car at this time, and Vanessa has to get home at her curfew at 1. It's already 12:40, and in order to be a good friend and get Vanessa home on time, Mr. Dawson decides to take Canyon Road. You're going to hear from an accident reconstructionist who's going to detail exactly how that accident happened. You're going to hear that Danny was driving on Canyon Road. It was almost 1 at night. It was pretty dark. But that wasn't the only obstacle that stopped Mr. Dawson from seeing the road. It was also raining really hard at that point. It was torrential. And Mr. Dawson could barely see the road. The rain also meant that the road was pretty wet. And the tires of the car that Mr. Dawson was driving didn't have that much traction. That's when a deer appeared in front of his car, ran in front of his headlights. Mr. Dawson wanted to avoid an accident, and he swerved to avoid that deer. He swerved, and his car went off the road a little bit. He tried to correct his car, and he got back on the road. In fact, he tried to stay on the road, but once again, he didn't have enough traction. The road was wet, and he couldn't keep control of the car because of the weather conditions. In the end, his car skidded, and he hit a tree. Now the accident reconstructionist, she's going to tell you exactly how this accident happened. She's going to tell you that Mr. Dawson swerving that night is consistent with the way an individual swerves to avoid an object. She's also going to tell you that the way that Mr. Dawson was driving showed that he was fighting to keep control of that car. He tried to avoid that accident and make sure that his passengers were safe. She's also going to tell you that it was the weather conditions, the darkness, the swerving of the car that caused the accident. Not Mr. Dawson's speed, not any other factors that were involved in the accident. After the accident, Mr. Dawson was taken by the police to the police station in order to be administered a breathalyzer test. Now, this breathalyzer test was analyzed by a doctor, and that doctor is going to appear before you today. She's going to tell you that the machine used by the state was not perfect. The machine used by the state made flaws, and as a result, the police saw Mr. Dawson's blood alcohol concentration to be much higher than it actually was. When we take all of these factors into account, we can only come to one conclusion: that what happened that night was an accident. It was not a murder. The prosecution has the burden of proof in today's case. It has to prove to you its conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. That's why you're going to find the defendant not guilty at the end of this trial.